we're looking at the most nutrient-dense plant on the planet. Think about moringa. Here we go again. It's got about 35% protein from fresh weight, the leaf, but dried, it has 18 of the very common amino acids that our body uses, and more importantly, it has all 9 of what we call the essential amino acids. Interesting thing about the moringa and the history of it, a lot of ethnic populations around the world who've been using moringa for centuries, if not millennia. It's only in the West we've actually come to discover moringa.
For thousands of years, people have been using moringa. Moringa is full of vitamins, antioxidants, micronutrients, and the ancients have been doing it since beginning of time. You can find moringa in a lot of ethnic places around the world. Ethnic villages and old cultures have been using moringa. So to talk about moringa, I've got an expert from Africa Green Moringa, Tim Turpin. Tim, welcome to the show.
Deepak, thank you, and great to be with you.
Tim, so we'd love to know how you ended up being so passionate and absorbed by moringa that you started a moringa company.
Deepak, in a nutshell, I majored in botany and biochemistry back in the 70s. But what that did, other than just being sort of highly academic, was that it gave me a language, the language of biochemistry and botany to learn and discover how plants actually work and how the chemistry of those plants work. What happened after a long career in animal nutrition, animal pharmaceuticals, project management, water treatment, I went full circle, retired from mainstream work 5 years ago when I was forced to retire from an engineering company. And it left me with a situation of what can I really do to stay hugely stimulated. In discussion with an old school friend of mine, he asked me about the goodness of moringa, and he said, why don't we get involved? We need to grow it. I said, look, I only know moringa as a plant, given the fact that the plant, in fact, is well represented, or the genus Moringa is very well represented in Africa. There are 13 species of moringa, only one family, and 9 of those are actually represented in Africa. And in southern Africa, we have our own. It actually lives in the dry areas of the western side of the country, mostly in Namibia. However, that plant isn't very lucrative in terms of its leaf and seed production because it's so busy trying to survive in harsh conditions. So, yeah, my reading got me going. And then every time I thought there's got to be a catch here, I'm reading and experiencing stuff that seems to be too good to be true. Turns out that it's actually not too good to be true. It actually simply is. We're looking at the most nutrient-dense plant on the planet. And nutrient density actually is something very important to talk about every now and again. Given that a quantity, if you imagine a handful of lettuce or spinach or kale or anything that might be considered to be highly nutritious, compared to that same handful of moringa, is actually, from a nutritive point of view, absolute chalk and cheese. The moringa contains over 140 nutrients. Yeah, so it's been a learning experience, but the learning experience has reached its pinnacle now in the knowledge that what the moringa tree brings us is actually quite phenomenal.
Wow, so that's really cool. So you actually only got into moringa about 5 years ago, and then through your research found it to be so beneficial and having so many benefits. And this is interesting because over the last, I would say, decade or so, moringa research has increased a lot and people are starting to become aware of it across the globe. I know it's quite big in Hawaii and Philippines and Mexico. Is it all over the world? Can you maybe give us some more background about this moringa plant?
Yes, it is fairly, I can't use the word ubiquitous, but it is fairly common. The key issue here is that Moringa oleifera, the one that we use commercially, is actually quite frost sensitive. So it generally tends to be tropical and subtropical. It originates from northern India and Pakistan, actually. So you can imagine the Indian climate being absolutely ideal. If one takes the actual tropical zones up to the point where the plant becomes frosted. So you can imagine in India, as you go further north into Pakistan, and when suddenly the Himalayas start creeping upward, so that the winters are cold, there's a definite line beyond which the tree won't flourish. And the same happens now in Africa. Moringa oleifera was introduced into West Africa probably about 500 odd years ago. So it was grown in the likes of Senegal, Burkina Faso, coming further around in towards the equator. And with time, it spread further south, then became common in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and then ultimately in South Africa as well. So we have a thriving industry here, but the plant is grown successfully in warmer climates. Frost-free, lovely hot days, cool evenings, well-drained soils, and Moringa will flourish.
Moringa is a very unassuming plant. I mean, it's not like a flamboyant tree. It doesn't look magnificent, from a look. It just looks like a very simple tree, I guess. And I understand that it's able to survive in very, very harsh conditions. So it has like an immense survival ability, storing water and somehow surviving through long periods of no rain and extreme heat. And this makes the plant, to me, I mean, quite amazing. But on top of this, you're saying this plant also has the most nutrients density. And I think that's the most important word, right? It's nutrient density. So how many nutrients are you getting per calorie of this food? And we're talking about relevant nutrients, right? So when people are talking about nutrient density in food, we're talking about nutrients that are actually important for the human body. So I'm curious to ask a few questions, but let's start off with what are the nutrients that are in this plant that are so beneficial that you can't get from our normal diet?
Deepak, what we do generally, because we are all exposed to words that become scattered about, either incorrect or a lot of false information out there. But they're words that the average person and the average housewife will know because she goes shopping. So people talk about protein, people talk about fat, people talk about carbohydrate, and so on. These are what are loosely termed macronutrients. If we take the key macronutrients and discuss them just very briefly, one by one, as far as if we start with the minerals, for argument's sake, a lot of plants are rich in many minerals. Things get labeled. So you take spinach, for argument's sake, and if I said to you the word spinach, you probably get an image of iron. But spinach is not offering you iron, it's offering you a whole bunch of stuff. And it is particularly high in iron, so it gets a reputation. Spinach, lots of iron. Bananas, lots of potassium. Milk, lots of calcium. So things get labeled with things that they tend to carry. Moringa now, on the other hand, actually has most of the important minerals that we require, and interestingly enough, in a ratio which is actually very beneficial for human consumption. And I say that because a lot of plants actually have sometimes a bit of an upside down concentration of some of their nutrients. Best example of that, probably soy. You know, think, okay, soy protein, good stuff. Yeah, it might be, but the amino acids in that protein are not a great ratio for human consumption. There's the good and the bad as far as that is concerned. But just going back to the minerals, the moringa is particularly rich in calcium and magnesium, also very high in iron, but very, very importantly, it's very strong on some of these microminerals, the important ones that that we all need in very small quantities, but which we need nonetheless for good health. And I take things like selenium, for argument's sake, and boron, and various things that are used in minute quantities in our bodies, but which are actually required. Selenium, for argument's sake, enhances the metabolism of vitamin E and therefore our skin health. Without it, our bodies suffer. That's the key thing regarding the minerals, and the vitamin status is actually more than interesting as well, because Moringa actually contains all of the vitamins other than B12, but it's got everything else. And interestingly enough, also in a reasonable concentration, of the non-Bs. In other words, the sort of A, C, and D, and to a small extent vitamin K. Moringa is actually very high in vitamin A. Great in rural countries where nutrition plans, particularly for growing children, are not particularly good. Vitamin A is actually vital for the evolution of good eyesight and eye health. And Moringa is loaded with, fresh Moringa, interesting enough, is loaded with vitamin C. But unfortunately, it's the one vitamin that does degrade a bit when the leaf is dry. A lot of the vitamin C is lost. Generally, the vitamin makeup and the B group vitamins, very, very strong and healthy in Moringa. Yeah, that brings us to the protein. Our proteins that our body makes up, are made up of amino acids. So these are words that people know. They say, yeah, I've got to go to the health shop and I've got to get some lysine, I've got to get this, I've got to get... Generally, you don't need to. You actually just need to have a balanced diet, quite frankly, and your body will get hold of the amino acids it needs, and via your genetic code will then make its own protein. There are a lot of diets and habits that humans across the board have, where sometimes the intake of amino acids is to the point where one of them might become, what we say in nutrition circles, become limiting. So your body might be looking for a particular amino acid in order to make a bunch of proteins, and it not being taken in sufficiently each day to the point where the body can actually do what it really would like to do at optimal speed. The net result is that biochemical pathway becomes stodgy, becomes restricted, and that's the sort of thing that happens with the modern diet, is that we often have the wrong mix of a lot of our amino acids. Think about Moringa. Here we go again. It's got about 35% protein from fresh weight leaf, but dried, it has 18 of the very common amino acids that our body uses, and more importantly, it has all 9 of what we call the essential amino acids, which we have to take in. There are 9 amino acids that all humans across the board have to take in daily in order to have their protein requirement met. Moringa is full of them all. It's in a very human-friendly ratio. So you'll find that the amino acid makeup of Moringa actually resembles animal protein almost, which is very unusual in the plant world to have such a very good amino acid makeup. Yeah, and then for me, the fourth bunch of macronutrients, which we all know about, are the fatty acids. Now, fatty acids are actually vital. Fatty acids are actually a vital component of our carbohydrate nutrition. And Moringa is very good in the right fatty acids in a good ratio. What that means basically is that there are good and bad fatty acids, which are related essentially to what the body is going to do with them and how those fatty acids get metabolized. And I think in a nutshell, bringing that other word that so many people know about, and these are the omega-3, 6, and 9 situations. The key issue is omega-3, simply because the omega-3 fatty acids are key for membrane production. If the wrong fatty acids, again, are overconsumed, where we talk about fat saturation, that's where that whole issue of cardiovascular disease, etc., come into play. But again, Moringa, great source of fatty acid. And in particular, bringing us back to the plant, just about the whole plant is edible. The whole tree is actually perfectly consumable and nutritionally rich. And that includes now the seed. These pods are actually responsible for the production of the seeds, a good seed the size of a thumbnail. And that seed is incredibly rich in oil, which of course is now the source of all these fatty acids we've been talking about. So we've got the leaf, which is now leafy green and healthy, and we've got the pure oil that is cold expressed from the seed, which is now the source of the oil. We'll discuss the oil a little later when we talk about products. But as far as the nutrients are concerned and the use of the tree, it's all absolutely useful. And as you say, it's quite an unusual tree in that it's not very woody. It's not the sort of tree you can go climb as a kid because you'll get halfway up and then the thing will bend over and snap. It's incredibly productive, and if properly pruned or allowed to be pruned for fresh leaf picking, it becomes incredibly bearing as far as young shoots are concerned for picking and drying. And if left to its own devices so that it can actually flower, and then each flower can produce one of these pods, the pods then produce the seed. Depending on how one allows the plant to grow, will depend on what the plant gives us.
So this is a good point to maybe pivot into the products that you have. How do you actually get people to consume moringa? Because your company is making moringa accessible to the public, right?
Interesting thing about the moringa, the history of it, and a lot of ethnic populations around the world who've been using moringa for centuries, if not millennia. It's only in the West we've actually come to discover moringa. Well, you just have to talk to an Ayurvedic practitioner or somebody who's sitting up in Venda who's been growing moringa in their backyard for the last couple of 100 years. They shrug their shoulders and they say, well, that's the trouble with you funny people from the West. You're only waking up now and discovering the magic of moringa. One very important thing as far as the Africa Green Moringa thing is concerned, and that brings me back to at least having a wee bit of science in my arsenal, is that if you look at the nutrient makeup of the leaf and you compare it to the seed, if you take away the oil fraction from the seed, in other words, the fatty acid fraction, which makes up about 30% of the seed, the makeup of the seed and the leaf are actually very similar. So all those nutrients that the leaf is carrying, the seed is carrying as well, along with all those fatty acids. And then I thought, well, maybe this tree is trying to give us a message here. Maybe it's saying that the leaf and the seed are actually being part of the same plant, of where all the goodness is going to lie. And I thought, well, why don't we combine them? If you go to the commercial shops now and look for moringa, you will invariably find leaf in powder form. Yes, because that's the old traditional form. You buy moringa, you buy green moringa powder, but it actually doesn't taste great when it's powdered. So one's got to be a little bit creative and add it to the smoothies. Yeah, so the smoothie people and the gym bunnies, the guys who are really working on their health and who do consume smoothies for breakfast, a lot of them add powders to their juices. Cooking with moringa is interesting because you should not cook with moringa. You should add moringa to your cooking, because just boiling leaves and or boiling the powder can actually destroy quite a few of those nutrients. So the powder best sprinkled onto a stew at the point where it comes off the heat just prior to being served. For argument's sake, is the best way to use the powder. However, you'll be hard-pressed to actually buy seed powder. So I figured, well, why don't we blend these two and get the best out of the tree? Turns out, if you just think of it practically, the seed tends to be, because of the fat, slightly oily. So mixing the seed powder and the leaf powder together, you can see that the green one is obviously the leaf capsule and the other one is the seed. I figured the best thing to do is to actually keep them separate, because the seed does mill surprisingly well, funny enough, despite its fat content, and to keep them together as one product but separate. Turned out to actually be the wiser decision than I initially thought, given the fact that the antioxidants and the anti-inflammatories are incredibly rich in the seed. And I found for people with inflammation-induced problems, arthritis, high cholesterol, cardiovascular problems, and in particular, actual or post or near type 2 diabetic scenarios. In other words, essentially people with high fasting glucose. The seed is incredibly rich in in the anti-inflammatory agents that reduce these things. So now the $1 million question came. What's the best ratio of combining these things? So I just figured, just looking at the chemistry, that combining these on a 1-to-1 ratio is a great way to go. And if anybody has an inflammatory issue, like cardiovascular disease, like arthritis, like type 2 diabetes, answer is to actually increase the seed consumption. So having them in separate capsules actually turned out to be a wise decision. Well, that wasn't my original plan. In other words, people can mix and match. Because remember that if you see a plant fresh and you mix it in a salad, your mother doesn't tell you and say, oh, please don't eat so much lettuce, or please don't eat so much spinach. And of course, they don't say, please don't eat so much moringa either, if you've got it fresh. But the minute you encapsulate, the human brain says, Mooty, oh, but how much can I take? How much should I take? What's the dosage? These are suddenly very pharmaceutical type questions. The only reason we put these parts of the plant into a capsule is for convenience. Yeah, so that brought us to the evolution of what we're basically calling the leaf seed combo. Then I wanted to get slightly different. Instead of just going off to an allopathic pharmacy and asking for moringa the whole time, I figured maybe we should try and get this moringa into a slightly different pack, whether it be funky or this, that. More important than funky is this pack is made out of recycled paper. So this pack is compostable. After it's been opened and finished, if you haven't planted a little sort of soil, made some holes in the bottom and planted a tree, or your kids haven't used it for a pencil case, it's actually compostable. So no plastic lying around.
So there's a lot of thought that has gone into your product. I mean, Tim, being a botanist, obviously understanding the plants, understanding the biochemistry and the relationship with our bodies, you've spent a lot of time and your scientific background and experience to design these special moringa products. Guys, I'm going to leave details to Tim's social media page. You can get in touch with him. His website, you can get in touch with Tim, you can see his products. So you can find that at African Green Moringa, they actually have a whole range of moringa products, moringa capsules like he's spoken about, but they also have oils, they also have body care products, creams and body oils and a whole range. So you can get the details below this video and you can go visit and get all the information about African Green Moringa. But Tim, we have unfortunately come to the end of our show. I know we can probably talk about moringa for hours because it is such a fascinating and magical plant, and there is so much information about it. And maybe in the future we can do another episode where we delve into one of the other products on moringa in a bit more detail.
Sure, absolutely, Deepak. It's just such a huge subject that it's very difficult to know where to start.
Exactly. But I think you've given us enough interest. We really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to chatting again in the future.
Thank you, Deepak. It's been a great pleasure.